Hi, and welcome to Barton Springs University Virtual Edition. My name is Bobby Levinsky, and I'm an attorney with the Save Our Springs Alliance. Here at Save Our Springs, our primary mission is to protect the water quality and water quantity of the Edwards Aquifer and the springs, creeks, and rivers that depend on it. You know, oftentimes when people hear that I'm an environmental attorney, they think that I'm out hugging trees or worshiping salamanders. And while that may be a perk of the job, in truth, most of the environmental regulations that we seek to enforce and that have been adopted across America are actually intended to protect human health and our overall quality of life. The Edwards Aquifer is the primary drinking water supply source for over 2 million residents in Central Texas. And that figure does not even include the city of Austin, which has identified the Edwards as an important potential future drinking water supply source to meet our growing demands over the next 100 years. In 2019, the city of Austin faced a new threat to its water that we haven't seen before. Toxic blue-green algae showed up at Lady Bird Lake. Blue-green algae is somewhat confusing because it's not actually an algae. It's a cyanobacteria. This is a form of bacteria that thrives in warm water such as lakes, ponds, and rivers. It's invisible to the naked eye, but as it rises from the bottom of the lake and clumps together, it starts to resemble algae. That's how it gets its name. It starts to form this gooey-like substance at the surface of the water that takes on the blue-green tint. Dogs are uniquely susceptible to blue-green algae because they're more likely to consume it as they're swimming in the water than humans. You know, as you throw a ball into the lake and the dog retrieves it, it's swimming and its mouth's open and it might actually take in some of the water into its body. Once that blue-green algae makes its way into the dog's system, it immediately begins attacking. It'll show up as symptoms like diarrhea and vomiting, seizures, and respiratory paralysis, which means that the dog's lungs stop breathing. As a dog owner, this horrifies me. And even if you aren't a dog lover, you should be concerned about blue-green algae because it can be harmful to human health. You might be kayaking or paddling on the lake and fall in and get some water into your system, or the blue-green algae might even make its way into the city's drinking water supply. The city of Toledo, for example, had to shut down its drinking water supply after toxic algae showed up in its lakes. Now, I know, why is this scary attorney guy trying to scare me away from drinking water? I'm not. What I'm trying to do is emphasize the importance of environmental regulations and actively monitoring the water quality of our water bodies. In the next video, I will be interviewing Dr. Brent Bellinger, an aquatic ecologist with the city of Austin. His job is to monitor the city's water bodies and make recommendations to city leaders on how best to protect water quality. I'm going to be asking Dr. Bellinger about his opinions on what might have caused the blue-green algae event, how the city is going to actively monitor it, what might be done to address it in the future, and how we as individuals might be able to protect ourselves from the harmful effects of blue-green algae. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Again, my name is Bobby Levinsky. I'm here with the Save Our Springs Alliance. I'm interviewing Dr. Brent Bellinger of the city of Austin. He's an aquatic ecologist who monitors the city's water bodies, including the lakes, rivers, and creeks that we all love and enjoy. And I think we're ready to begin. Can you hear me, Dr. Bellinger?
Yes, I can. Thanks for having me, Bobby. It's good to be here.
Thanks for participating in Barton Springs University. Again, you're one of our favorite speakers. I just wanted to first let people get to know you a little bit. So how did you choose to get your career in environmental science?
It's a great question. I was very fortunate to grow up, despite being in Milwaukee in a big city. I was about a mile from Lake Michigan. So I was exposed to that large water body. Milwaukee had a lot of great green spaces. parks, rivers, creeks throughout the city. And every year with the family, we'd go up to northern Wisconsin, which is known as the Lakes District. And me and my dad spent a lot of time fishing. So at a very early age, I developed an interest in our aquatic resources and had decided very early on that that was what I wanted to pursue, to become a limnologist.
Did you see any pollution when you were growing up? Is that kind of what got you interested in like the water quality itself?
You know, we saw it. It was just kind of what it was. You know, again, being in the city, you saw a lot of revetment and alterations to the natural environment. Even back then, there were preservation and restoration projects going on. Some of the groups in Milwaukee are very proactive in trying to restore ecological integrity. You know, those were kind of concepts or things that, you know, I can look back on in hindsight and recognize now. But at the time, it was just, you know, what kind of makes these water bodies really neat and cool? How do I produce and catch big bass or big walleye, big bluegill, stuff like that? And then it turns out it's a pretty complicated story of things that go into putting a nice slab on the table with a shore lunch.
It's fair enough. So you turned it into a career. You got your PhD at Michigan Tech. What was the PhD in? What was your doctorate degree in?
Uh, Basically, so in estuarine ecosystem, so it was a collaboration between Michigan Tech and the University of Essex. So I was very fortunate that I did a lot of lab work at Michigan Tech. Their long winters were perfect for being inside. And then in the summers, I would go over to Colchester in England, southeast coast of England, about a hour train ride outside of London, working at the University of Essex, which was perched along the Colne estuary. And this ecosystem is unique. It didn't have a lot of vegetation that grew. There was a large tidal flux, you know, daily, twice a day. And when the tide would go out, the exposed mudflats would turn this light brown color. And what that was were diatoms, basically little photosynthetic algae that live in glass cases. They would migrate up to the surface of the sediments so that they could photosynthesize, do their thing, and then when the tide would come back, they would go back down into the sediments. So this research project was interested in the polymers, the extracellular polymers that the diatoms produce to help in their motility, to form the cohesive mats at the sediment surface, and their role in stabilizing sediments and fueling the bacterial, you know, kind of food web and, you know, fluxes of carbon in and out of the system.
So we're talking today about blue-green algae. As I kind of previewed before this video, in 2019, the city of Austin experienced some incidents of toxic blue-green algae that showed up in Lady Bird Lake. So could you help us understand first, what is toxic blue-green algae?
Yeah, so cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, they get that name, you know, cyano is a derivative for blue-green. These are actually bacteria, so they're not a true algae, they're not a eukaryote, they're a prokaryote. So they're very ancient. They were the first photosynthetic organisms on the planet. So they are responsible really for what turned Earth into an oxygen-rich planet. Everything else kind of evolved after that. Of course, it killed a lot of things because oxygen, it turns out, is quite toxic. So cyanobacteria have actually been toxic and killing things for 3 billion years, for what that's worth. But so these are photosynthetic organisms that are found in every wet environment around the world. And, you know, they're just part of the ecosystem. Unfortunately, what can happen when environmental conditions are favorable for that group, when there's very warm temperatures, kind of stagnant conditions, and an excess of nutrients, what you get is this prolific growth, what's known as a bloom, that occurs. And frequently what happens when you reach a certain kind of bloom magnitude and size is the cyanobacteria start to produce toxins. There's a lot of different theories about why they make the toxins, if it's a overflow mechanism, if it's competitive, so that they're, you know, outcompeting other algae or other organisms that are trying to get these nutrients. So there's different facets and rationales for why they might produce the toxins. And then, so what we're looking at here, this is the bloom, the proliferation that we had in Lady Bird Lake. These are mats. As I alluded to with my PhD research, it turns out that when you get a lot of algae growing together in a matrix, they tend to stick together with extracellular polysaccharides, proteins, and other things. But basically, you just get this, nice rigid structure. These organisms, the cyanobacteria, growing on the bottom of Lady Bird Lake in this mat, photosynthesizing, producing oxygen, which makes them buoyant. They float up to the surface, what you see in the picture. And then this is when you're more likely to get an interaction with animals or with people. The other type of bloom that can occur with cyanobacteria is a planktonic bloom. So these are, instead of the algae kind of working together in a matrix, the cells just kind of do their own thing, floating in the water column. So like in the picture behind you, if you imagine that whole thing turning a pea soup green, that would be a planktonic algae bloom. That's what you see like Toledo, what you see, in Lake Erie. Most lakes tend to experience the planktonic types of blooms.
Okay, and so why did we get the first type rather than the Platonic?
That's a great question. We're researching that. In years past, during the last drought, we did observe elevated concentrations of planktonic cyanobacteria in Lake Austin and in Lady Bird Lake. We were fortunate that our measurements, Austin Water, monitoring the drinking water supply, we never measured any toxins associated with the planktonic blooms. So what caused last year's event, the benthic blooms, and for it to go toxic, two very kind of surprising situations. And we have some hypotheses that we've generated, related to, continuing climate change, with the introduction and proliferation of zebra mussels, the 2018 flood event that occurred in October, November, which brought a lot of sediments and fresh supply of organic matter into the ecosystem. So there's a lot of potential things that all kind of came together last year that the Highland Lakes may not have necessarily seen all together at the same time previously.
So I guess it's still a possibility that we could see some sort of type of Platonic bloom that does become toxic as well. So that's not something that's out of the question in Austin's future.
Correct. It's something that, us, Austin Water, LCRA, we're continuing to look and monitor for, again, because it is the most common type, given the type of water bodies we have, where the planktonic blooms occur, again, kind of larger open water areas versus these benthic blooms that tend to be tucked near shore, backwater areas, etc. So yeah, so both are still very possible.
So we know that this was discovered after dogs were swimming in the water. They started getting sick. How did the city proceed to investigate?
The city response was great. It was very fast. When the first 311 calls came in, a couple of my colleagues went out to Redbud Isle. That picture you showed was actually taken that initial weekend when the reports were coming in.
So that's what it looked like in 2019.
Yep.
Yep.
So looking at that algae, where it was congregating in these areas where the dogs were swimming in, and the symptoms that the dogs unfortunately suffered prior to their death, everything just kind of lined up that it was a cyanobacteria event. Samples were collected, some microscopy was done initially to see what organisms were in the mats, verify that these are potentially toxigenic cyanobacteria. We had a couple of different universities then that extracted the mats to look to see what toxin might be present. And it was at that point that two independent labs identified a very potent neurotoxin in those mats. So again, everything kind of then fit together. The story made sense. At that point, Redbud Isle was closed down. The other dog launches around Lady Bird Lake were closed down. And we began a new monitoring kind of regime to kind of track when that proliferation would end for last year.
So we know that dogs ended up dying after they ingested this neurotoxin. Is it a neurotoxin that dogs are uniquely susceptible to, or is why was it dogs that we saw the first symptoms in?
Right. You know, they're the ones that are the most curious. You know, whether it's direct, you know, just lapping of the water and taking it up. If some of the algae, again, you saw it floating, if it gets in the fur of longer haired species, and then it just in the process of grooming, they get it. In the literature, livestock, dogs do seem to be very susceptible to this. You know, if it's something that's part of their physiology or just how much they incidentally or accidentally ingest. But dogs are very susceptible to this. You know, people were very unlikely to consume that type of algae. So that's why to date, knock on wood, there have been no reported human deaths related to antitoxin, which is a great thing. But again, it's, you know, that type of algae, a person is not very likely to ingest that. Even if you're lapping up some of the water, we did not measure toxins free in the water. So you really had to take in that algae. And that's unfortunately what happened with the dogs last year.
But it may be something as simple as dogs are more likely to eat something oozy and gross than a human is.
Yep.
So
Yep.
they might say, "Oh, that looks good," and ingest it.
Yep. Where
But
people have to worry is if there's a planktonic bloom, if you get a large die-off of the algae, of the cyanobacteria cells in the water, when the cells die and rupture, they release those toxins into the water, and then that's when it gets into the drinking water supply, or someone that's recreating swimming, indirect ingestion, they're likely to be impacted. Again, we were very fortunate last year, different type of algae bloom, different type of toxin than you typically get with a planktonic bloom, and we didn't have any of these toxins in the water.
okay, so if it were more of the platonic type of bloom that they saw in the city of Toledo, for example, and people were out paddling and fell in the water, that would be where it would be more of a concern for human health than
Exactly.
what last in 2019.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's why many municipalities, when they see a large planktonic bloom, they will close down the water body to all recreational use.
And so if it does get into the water supply, are there methods to treat the water to make sure that it doesn't make it into people's glasses of water?
Yes. Austin Water has been actively working and researching this, looking at the most effective treatment methods for different types of toxins. They routinely monitor the raw water and the treated water to make sure that nothing is making it through the pipes.
Okay. I'm going to share with you a map of where I know, based off of media reports, where it was discovered so far in Austin. So we know that it was on Red Bud Island, Auditorium Shores, and Festival Beach. Are you aware of any other locations that this has shown up in Austin?
Um, at the mouth of Shoal Creek, we added that site. Wanted to look at there's some kind of unique um, hydrology that occurs right around the Lamar, between Lamar and First Street. And so there might be an interplay in how the algae are moving with wind and currents between the north and south shores. So the mats, you know, were toxic there. You know, these are just our routine monitoring sites. Again, the algae that's growing and proliferating around Redbud Isle that's floated up to the surface is then going to be mobile when there's wind, when there's releases through the dams. So that the algae is distributed really throughout the reservoir. You know, as it's getting flushed, it will likely disintegrate, break apart, become less of an issue. But it could, you know, obviously it moves shoreline to shoreline, can get tucked into backwater areas. So those are just our routine sites, but there's no reason to think that it's not in other spots.
So, are you aware of any other locations and any other hill country rivers or any of our other lakes? Because I know that the Shoal Creek still connects to Lady Bird Lake. So, right now it's still just kind of isolated in Lady Bird Lake itself.
Yeah, that's, you know, the reports. Everything seems to be that the toxic algae is isolated so far to Ladybird Lake. LCRA has established a reporting website. So if people suspect there's a cyanobacteria bloom occurring, they can report it to LCRA. They'll go out and then do some additional sampling. That's throughout the Highland Lakes, downriver. We keep an eye on what's growing and what the creeks look like. But for now, what we've tested and measured is just for Ladybird Lake.
So I know that you've mentioned this before, but I wanted to kind of like maybe break it down a little bit more of what you think might be the root causes. One of the things that you mentioned was nutrient deposits that are in the lake. I saw in a previous presentation that you did that there was some flooding events that may have helped shift some of the soil from upstream downstream that may have been part of that. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit about what nutrients you're looking for and what the algae might be growing on?
Yeah, I mean, really the two fuels for cyanobacteria are nitrogen and phosphorus. These are two nutrient species that can be bound onto sediment particles, whether it's from animal waste, livestock, farming. Any excess gets mixed into the soil matrix. Of course, we are in flash flood alley. When you get large rain events out in the hill country, mobilizing those sediments into the creeks and the receiving Colorado River, all that moves down river. And then, as it hits each of the impoundments, each of the different reservoirs, some of that material will drop out. 2018 was an extraordinary event that turned so many of our reservoirs into, again, chocolate milk is what it looked like. So this was a tremendous loading of potential nutrients into the system. Cyanobacteria are, again, they've been around for a long time. They've figured a lot of things out. They're one of the few organisms uniquely adapted to what would be otherwise kind of bio-unavailable nutrients. They can go out and scavenge it. So if there's phosphorus that's bound up on something else, the cyanobacteria can produce an enzyme to cleave that phosphorus, and then they can use that for their growth. They can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. They can also go after nitrogen using different enzymes. They can sequester excess nutrients. You think most organisms, they only take up what they need in the moment for their growth. Cyanobacteria, they see a lot of phosphorus available. They're kind of putting on that winter weight just in case. So they can sequester in these different polyphosphate bodies are called. It's just a long chain of phosphorus ions. They're just hoarding it for later on. So, and then other algae can't compete with them for those nutrients. So there's a lot that they can do when they're presented with different resources in order to outcompete and proliferate.
So you mentioned that phosphorus can be found in animal waste. We know that Redbud Island is a frequent spot for people who have dogs to go out and swim, and dogs might do their business while they're out there. Have you considered that maybe dog poo might be partially responsible for the growth at Redbud Island?
That obviously cannot be discounted. That is a significant source of nutrients. We recommend everybody scoop the poop, pick up after your pets. If you walk around any of the trails, obviously not every dog owner is a good steward of that message. But this, and this is something that, again, the dogs have been out at Redbud Isle for years without any recorded incidents. So what happened last year, was it just kind of that was, one of the nails in the coffin? But, would that be the primary driver? Probably not, but it's something that, we're obviously looking at still.
And then considering it might be a multitude of factors, I know you also have mentioned heat and climate change as a contributing factor. Could you kind of expand on how heat's involved in it and what climate change might do in our future for this?
Yeah, I mean, Central Texas is hot here, but the cyanobacteria really like warm weather, warm temperatures, that's when they really, their growth really kicks up. So as we have our average daily temperature is higher, um, as we get these longer periods of 100-degree, high temperatures throughout the summer, all that's going to do is just keep shifting the average water temperature up, and in favor of the cyanobacteria. Then that's compounded really with the climate change beyond the temperature increases. It's these changes in rainfall. Again, we're here in Flash Flood Alley, and while the big rainfall events get a lot of the press, the other things that people don't think about are these micro droughts that can occur. So you have these couple of month periods with no rainfall, things dry out, the ground gets loose, gets cracked, and then when you get one of these large rainfall events, you're more likely to flush out a lot of these sediments into the receiving water bodies. And unfortunately, most of the models, most of the observations that we're seeing with climate change is you're seeing more of these extremes, a very, very large rainfall event, a long period of no rain, another big rainfall event. So you just keep hammering basically your receiving water bodies with not enough flow, and then way too much flow, and the deposition of a lot of organic matter and inorganic matter. So climate change is, really just going to exacerbate these other problems that are, in the watershed.
So it's the increase in just temperature, it's the increase in rain and excessive rainfall events, and an increase in drought that all kind of contribute to the perfect conditions for something like toxic blue-green algae to grow in our lakes.
Yep, and that's why it's the occurrences, documentation of it globally are on the rise, and it all fits that same pattern.
Another thing that you mentioned, zebra mussels. Could you explain what a zebra mussel is?
Zebra mussel is a little mollusk. It's from Eurasia. It was brought into the Great Lakes on accident in the ballast water of one of the salties that comes in. We do a lot of intercontinental trade between the U.S., between Europe. These ships are carrying a lot of different cargo. When they don't have any cargo, they use water for ballast. You put a bunch of water in your home port. You bring that to the Great Lakes. You dump all that water out before you take on your load. And what you've done is just expel this extreme soup of a variety of organisms. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of species that have been introduced into the Great Lakes by ballast water, unfortunately. Some are more benign and others more dramatic. Zebra mussels are an ecosystem engineer, and their cousin, the quagga mussels, an ecosystem engineer. They're able to dramatically alter every aspect of an aquatic ecosystem. And the most obvious impact they have is that the water clarity increases. People are like, oh, hey, clear water, it's great. Yeah, not so much for things that need food in the water column to feed on. So if all of a sudden all of your food resources are gone because zebra mussels can filter a gallon of water a day, that's a problem. Of course, there's the incidental impacts of zebra mussels on infrastructure, having to clean intake pipes, fouling up boat docks, boat hulls, boat motors, dead shells washing up on beaches and cutting people's feet and hands. Those are all awful things. And then the other thing that people don't see under the water that's occurring, if you have all these nutrients, algae, particles in the water, and it's all being taken up and eaten by the zebra mussels, what does everything do? Everything poops. So what you get from a zebra mussel is this beautiful little fertilizer pellet that completely coats the bottom. You now have a lot more sunlight getting to the bottom because there's nothing in the water column, and you get prolific algae growth, plant growth, or other issues in the ecosystem. So they change all of those things, and those changes in those nutrient dynamics, again, green algae blooms, cyanobacteria blooms are being linked to zebra mussels invading a system.
So you said that they were from the Great Lakes, or that's how they first got into our systems here.
Yeah.
Did you bring them with you when you came from Michigan? How did they to Lady Bird Lake?
Unfortunately, this would have been due, you know, the the ships that were coming in, there were no rules or regulations on treatment of ballast water. Since then, there are rules in place, but it still comes down to boater responsibility, being a good steward. And unfortunately, there's still just a lot of people that don't take the time to clean their boat hulls, to clean the lower unit of their motors, to empty out their bilges or their bladders. And so when they go from, vacation hopping, going to different water bodies, and then, kind of doing the same thing, you dump out or exchange the water in your bilge or exchange the water in your bladder, you're introducing this organism to a new place. So they move through Texas really fast, and this is going to be driven by just irresponsible boaters.
So the best thing an individual might be able to do to help stop the spread of zebra mussels would be to just simply clean their boats when they get out of the water and before they go into the water.
Yep, always clean it. Let everything dry out. If you can, use very hot water. Use a chemical treatment, an alcohol or something else, vinegar to clean out anything that might have had water. Let everything dry thoroughly before going to a new water body.
And I guess one of the problems you were explaining with zebra mussels is that they're kind of like terraformers. They come in and create their own environment, change the environment. And that's what's possibly leading to some of the conditions that are ripe for the toxic blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, to grow and then ultimately kill our dogs.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay. Well, this has been incredibly helpful. Do you think that there's anything else that you would want to share with folks about either the concerns about the toxic blue-green algae, or what they might be able to do to help monitor the situation moving forward?
Some of the things that people can do, we talked about cleaning up pet waste. Obviously, that's really important at the parks. It's just as important to clean up after your dogs if you're downtown, if you're in any of the parks or green spaces. Lady Bird Lake is at the bottom of all these drainage basins. So anything that's going on in your neighborhood, whether it's fertilizing your lawns, mowing to the edge of a pond on a golf course, not having buffer strips, all these things just contribute excess nutrients into the water bodies that makes it down here. If you live, upriver, if you're in the watershed to Lady Bird Lake, it doesn't matter where you are in the Highland Lakes, plant native vegetation, keep buffer strips, do what you can to keep as much sediment on site as possible. Because again, big rains, everything flushes down, this is where it ends up, and all these things are fuel. Once you get these problems, they kind of become these self-sustaining positive feedback loop issues. Legacy phosphorus is one of the most difficult things to deal with in an aquatic system. When it's in the sediments, it just constantly gets remobilized, grows in an algae or plant. As that thing dies, resettles down. So you just have this constant reuse of these nutrients, and it takes decades and decades before you can bury those excess nutrients or flush them out of a system. So you don't want them there in the first place. For monitoring, obviously be diligent. If you're in, around any pond, any water body, look for, keep an eye out for algae that looks gross. If it's dark black, if it's bluish, if it's a dark green, probably a bad algae. If the water looks like pea soup or someone spilled green paint, that's a problem. Keep your animals away from it. Keep your kids away from it. Kids and dogs, I think they kind of have the same proclivities for just putting everything in their mouth. Not a good thing. And, we'll keep working towards this, trying to identify what we can do and taking those steps.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bellinger. We really appreciate you at Barton Springs University, and we hope to have you back.
Thank you very much. Anytime.
Thank you. Many thanks to Dr. Bellinger for participating in that interview today. To help us complete this lesson, let's just do a quick recap about what we learned about blue-green algae. First, we learned that blue-green algae is not really an algae at all. It's actually a cyanobacteria. It gets its name because it resembles algae as it rises to the water surface. Blue-green algae is toxic to humans as well as dogs and other animals. It grows in warm, stagnant water, often what we find in Austin in the midsummer months. It feeds on nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen that are present in the water. Possible contributing factors for the proliferation of blue-green algae include climate change, such as excessive heat and rainfall events, invasive species such as zebra mussels that have changed the chemical composition of the water, and pollution such as dog poo and fertilizer that are rich in nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen. Dr. Bellinger also helped us out with some tips on what we can do to keep ourselves and our dogs safe from blue-green algae. First, you want to avoid warm, stagnant water, especially if there's algae visible on its surface. After your dog takes a swim, immediately rinse them off to make sure that there's no algae stuck within its fur. To help mitigate the contributing factors that help blue-green algae grow, we want to make sure that we're picking up our dog's poo and properly disposing of it. We want to wash our boats before and after use in the lake to prevent invasive species from making their way into other water bodies. And we want to reduce our carbon footprint to help slow the pace of global warming. Many thanks for viewing this video and participating in Barton Springs University. Please make sure to check out some of our other videos. And if you have any more questions about blue-green algae, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.